So it's good to be sitting down another evening. We've got some storms rolling in on us soon here, so hopefully we're not going to have any interference, and we're hoping to get everything recorded before the lightning and possibly some tornadic activity comes our way. So, think good thoughts for us. But I am here. I'm Nick, Pennsylvania. I am here as always with my good friend Brendan Bond. It's just the two of us tonight, but we're going to be hearing from some other voices in a moment because Brendan and his brother have gone out at the advice of his friend Jen to check out a haunted road in our county, in the northern part of our county, about 20 minutes north of where I live, actually. So I'm really curious to hear about this and to hear Brendan and his brother Brian driving about the county. Before we do, Brendan Bond, tell us about Jen and how she contacted you about this and kind of the backstory before we listen to this.
Yeah, so me and Jen have been friends for quite a long time, and she's always been interested in the paranormal as well, and has been thankfully a diligent listener since we started the Ghost Furnace. And this is not actually the first time she's contributed. She was the one who was able to find the Peninsula Python update, if you guys remember that from one of the early episodes.
And I'm really excited that you mentioned that because after we listen to this and talk about it a little bit, I actually have a couple snake stories as well. Go ahead.
Yes, that's actually, that is very serendipitous, actually. But yeah, so me and her were just kind of talking as we do, and I was saying, like, oh, I really like to find somewhere close by, because we've been talking more and more about doing more on-site, not investigations, but just like going to haunted places and just seeing what's up and what they're like, and bringing them to you guys. And she had mentioned these two locations on this road that were right near where all of us went to college at, which was why I was surprised. I had never heard of this area before. Nick, had you ever heard of the haunting in this area?
Now, I'm familiar with the road. I'm familiar with the church you were at because I had a landlord that lived back there coincidentally for a while. Having
Oh.
said that, I have heard stories, but the problem is I went back through my notes that I've kept over the years and my sources, and I did find that I had a document of this road and these stories. However, well, I'll get into why I may have gotten it mixed up when I talk about it after we listen to this.
Excellent. Yeah. So what I'd like to do to give you guys some context is just speak a little bit about the two stories and what we were able to find ahead of time, just so you have some context going into the field recordings. So we're talking about a road called St. John's Road, which is like Nick had mentioned, is in kind of north central, northeastern Butler County. And this was all news. This was all new to me. The two stories have to deal with a railroad crossing and a bridge that are relatively, we found, we're actually very close together. The first story is of a woman who was apparently walking the railroad tracks and was hit by a train, thrown into the creek where she died. And apparently she haunts the railroad crossing, showing up as either ghost lights or an apparition to warn people to stay off of the railroad tracks. Which is kind of which is on its own is kind of a crazy story. It has the normal, like, oh, haunted railroad crossing, but a number of locations or a number of sources that I found all mention how she was hit by a train and thrown into the creek where she died, which is like an interesting thing to mention, which we'll actually talk about on site a little bit. And then the other one is this haunted bridge, this dead man's bridge on the same road. The story for that is a little bit older from what I can figure out, from early 1900s, where someone was driving a car, a husband and wife, and they rear-ended a wagon on this bridge, and both the husband and wife were killed. And apparently you see You apparently see ghost lights on the bridge, and you also hear the sounds of screaming coming towards you while on the bridge. Once I'd heard these first two stories, of course, we do what we always do, which is try and find historical context to put these things in. I, through my sources, was unable to find any like newspaper articles that referenced either of these two accidents. Now, for how small the area is, you would think things like that would have been reported and newsworthy. The only articles I was able to find were ones that referenced the two hauntings with no other real context. And we see this a lot, urban legends where you'll have a bunch of, you're like, oh, we have 15 websites that all have articles with with this information, but it all is strikingly similar and they seem to kind of reference each other.
That's referencing each other, and I think we've talked in the past about somebody said something once, it was misquoted, and then that misquote just keeps getting perpetuated. But let's go ahead and listen to the audio and come back and talk about it a little bit.
Sounds great. So Brian, are you familiar with the two apparent hauntings on St. John's Road? No. So, me and my brother are out here in, I guess, like north central Butler County. I got a tip on a road that has apparently two haunted locations on it. The first one is a railroad crossing. Apparently, a woman was walking the tracks, was hit by a train, and thrown into the creek where she died. And she apparently haunts the railroad crossing looking for, or trying to warn people. So, like, it's like a benevolent spirit. Then there is apparently a bridge on the road, St. John's Road, same road, where back in the early 1900s, a car with a husband and wife hit a wagon, and those two were killed. Apparently, there wasn't any, I couldn't find anything saying anywhere about what happened to the person in the wagon, so. Now, both of these stories, everywhere I found had relatively similar tellings of the story. And were very vague about the time periods. So I think this kind of falls into the realm of local folklore, We're not far from a place called the Old Stone House, which is apparently haunted as well, which is I want to say it's like a turn of the century. Not that's St. John's Road. That's the road I need to go on. Found it. So we're at St. John's Church, apparently. So we're turning around in their parking lot. And we're going to go down St. John's Road and see what we can find. Depending on how safe it is, we will stop right there. Depending on how safe it is, we will stop at the railroad tracks and bridge if we can find it. But we'll see how things look. Lots of granite rocks around the area. I'm not sure where the creek would be that was hit. Oh, here's the railroad tracks. Oh, so these are like right here. Okay, I'm going to turn around. Let's get out and just look around real quick. These look like pretty modern railroad tracks. They look modern in the sense that, like, they're maintained. There's like a cutout ditch. We have purple markings which is common. I mean, they're nice open tracks, so like, I mean, this is not the most, I mean, you should never play around on active railroad tracks, obviously, but this is certainly not the most dangerous set of tracks I've ever seen, in the sense that if something's coming from both directions, you can see it for plenty of distance. And the bridge is apparently right here too. Look at that. Yeah, it's like right there. So it's funny because looking at the map and everything online, it looks like it's a lot further away, but it's all just kind of right here.
Maybe there's more than one bridge.
Yeah, maybe there's more than one bridge. But if she was hit and then thrown, like that's a long way to be thrown. Like if the water's right down there. You're still talking like, for being generous, we're saying 50, 60 feet. Which would obviously kill somebody, but like, I don't know if a body would get thrown that far. You know what I mean?
No way. Through the woods?
Yeah. Like that part doesn't really add up, in my mind.
Unless down like the bend is closer.
Yeah. But even then, how close, like...
But then you're not that close to the bridge.
They're not that close to the bridge at that point. And I mean, and that's the thing is, even if so let's say the bridge is where the person got hit by the people in the car, like, again, coming this direction, it's like right there. But there is a curve on the other side, so I could see people...
The people got hit on the bridge?
Yeah, it's apparently where the wagon was. And the two people driving the car are the ones who died. I mean, besides that, it's a pretty little area. It's kind of, the place doesn't have a weird vibe or anything. I mean, we're here towards dusk. It's not quite dusk yet, but we're in the ballpark. But I tell you, it is funny. I would expect to see more litter around here if kids were coming here often as like a spooky place.
Yeah.
But there's pull-offs on both sides.
Let's head down by the bridge.
Yeah, let's just drive over the bridge and see how the bridge looks. And probably turn around and come back. But you couldn't be, unless where she was hit was like way further down on another part of the railroad where it is closer to the water.
Maybe there's another railroad crossing.
Not in this road, because this road goes this direction. Because I've been looking at maps and everything. But let's see how this water looks down here.
Maybe this is a newer bridge.
That's possible. Because it said turn of the century. Am I good down there?
I think so.
Oh. They say she apparently warns people by either showing up or by there being like lights, like spook lights, you know?
On the tracks?
On the tracks, yeah. Which is like pretty common. Let's all see Butler County. This bridge is from 2007, so this can't be the same bridge.
No, it's a nice little stream.
It's a cool little stream though. I think it's called like Bull Run or something like that. Because look how far away the tracks are over there.
Yeah.
But again, there is like that creek there. But I mean, definitely someone getting hit by a train. I can see it throwing somebody, but not this far. That's a lot of signage. A lot of signage out this way. Camp. Just gonna turn around right here. Because I was looking at the map earlier, and it all goes further away from the water and railroad from here. So, but I mean, this water obviously isn't new. So like.
Yeah.
I guess we could assume that this bridge is in fact new, but maybe there was a bridge, a ricketier version of this bridge earlier. Because
in the same spot.
The same
It
general
doesn't look like the
general
road
spot.
was diverted.
No, at least doesn't seem that way because it doesn't. Because I mean, you can't put the road anywhere down there. It's marshy.
Low.
Yeah. Yeah, it's all pretty low line. But I mean, with this bend, again, we're going 15 miles an hour, and you can't see the bridge until you're like on top of it. So
Yeah.
I think someone getting hit here makes a lot of sense,
Oh, definitely.
unfortunately. But you are close enough to houses that way, especially. And there is other railroad crossings. We saw a car crossing whenever we were just standing out here.
Yeah.
So I think like the idea of seeing lights, there's nothing in that direction, but there's tons of stuff in this direction. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So like, I guess it would be easy to see lights, you know, from a distance.
And because there's like small camps and houses
Yeah.
back there, it could be coming through.
And since you do, I mean, I hate the whole like swamp gas type thing, but given like how marshy it is around here, if that is a thing that can happen, like if that is a legitimate phenomenon, like that would be another like good excuse. But yeah, my big takeaway is I don't think someone could get hit and thrown that far.
No.
But the wagon getting hit makes a ton of sense. Now, again, with both of these stories, I was only able to find a few references and was not able to find any historic precedent, because like you'd think if two people died in a car accident in the early 1800s, and before that, if someone was hit close by and thrown into the creek and died, that would make the newspapers. But before I even bring this to Nick, I'm going to do some further research to try and find that, and our contributor Jen is going to be doing some research as well. She's the one who originally kind of turned me on to this stuff. That being said, there's a creepy cemetery right here too.
There's a zombie.
There's a zombie up there. Yeah. Man, that guy's not in a hurry. You can tell how rural a road legitimately is by how long it takes its residents to cross it, I feel like. Yeah, so that is our initial on-site look at St. John's Road. So that was the audio for on site on St. John's Road. And again, for a little context, the stories that we found all mention these lights and the screams and everything and apparitions at night. We were there probably about an hour before dusk. So we maybe weren't there in the best conditions to recreate these anomalies. Just going off of what you heard there, Nick, what are some of your thoughts about these stories and about what me and my brother saw?
Well, one of the first things I wanted to say, which I had alluded to earlier, is why I couldn't recall if I had heard about these before. And the reason is because these stories are so similar to some other stories in the region. And I'm certain that stories that span across North America and probably Europe as well. It seems that with the advent of the automobile, there becomes a lot of lore surrounding the automobile and all cautionary things and kind of about the conflict between the old and new, like the automobile running into the back of a buggy, which is something that here in Western Pennsylvania with our large Amish Deitch community, we still sadly have those sort of encounters. I will say that it specifically got mixed in my mind with a very similar story that occurs in the New Wilmington, Pennsylvania area. If you're from outside of Pennsylvania, this is near the border with Ohio towards the Youngstown, Canton, Akron, Ohio area. There is a river we fished in the Shannock, and it has a very similar story about a couple young Deitch boys in a buggy, and they get thrown into the creek. I think the horse was spooked by something like an automobile, and they're thrown into the creek and they drown. I am happy to hear that you talked about the distance of the creek to the road and the railroad. So my question is, I know that is still a very active railroad, as you noticed, kind of observed that there. So the old line probably laid to the left or the right of it, has the road change course, has the stream change course. These things happen, but my feeling is that This has likely started with a grain of truth. There have probably been at least one, possibly more fatal accidents on that road, and things evolve from there. And I hate to put you like in a weird place, but you know very well just how bad a very sharp turn can be, as you yourself live off a country road and you
Mhm.
live right in front of a very sharp turn. And I don't know. In your time living there, I know you've seen a lot of really nasty accidents, and I'm kind of curious, are there any similar stories about the road on which you live, other than the fact that you live off the road famous for Night of Living Dead?
Yeah, I was gonna say that's probably the most famous element of the road I live on is we are very near the original cemetery from the first Night of the Living Dead movie, which is something that whenever I was small was very consistently creepy for me. That being said, I don't because a lot of the accidents have been like in the last, like 20, 30 years. I don't know if there's any lore yet, but this used to be the historic Venango path as well. So this corridor that I'm in has been traveled for a long, long time. And as far as I know, there is no other lore around the area. That would be an interesting thing to look further into with like the local historic society and whatnot, because I'm honestly not sure. It's a really good question, Nick.
So I'm thinking about the stories of St. John's Road right now, and there's a couple things that come to mind. Of course, anytime we talk, and you brought it up about like swamp gas, which is a thing everybody says, which I don't know how real that is, but there are bioluminescent fungi aplenty. There are other things that could create light, just even atmospheric things, if not plant and fungi themselves. So I mean, I'm glad you went there. I also think about the fact that if this is, I think this is more of a cautionary tale that the lore grew up around. However, if you saw somebody, they were trying to flag you down or trying to warn you, but they were very clearly a ghost, that would create more reckless driving, I feel. I'm not slowing down.
That's a really good point that I don't think people bring up enough. Yeah, because I mean, obviously there are stories where you hear of full-bodied apparitions where like the person's like, "Oh, that is a ghost." Like 10 out of 10, no question about it, that's a ghost. But there's other times people talk about full-bodied apparitions where they look as normal and real as you or me, which is relatively normal and real. You're right. I feel that if it was an obvious ghost, that would create a dangerous situation. I'm not sure if that part of the rationale makes it into the initial lore, but I think you're right though that I mean obviously it's a cautionary tale. But that being said, how often do we see instances where a cautionary tale or a place that has a kind of blown out of proportion story that maybe does come from a grain of truth that doesn't discount the fact that there still might be legitimate paranormal activity happening in the area? Just because like I mentioned, like when you're at the railroad tracks, you look one way, there's like nothing. There's nothing for a few hundred yards. The other way, however, looking northbound, you can see, I believe, two other railroad crossings, and it goes for a good, probably half mile, three-quarters of a mile before it bends. So the odds of there being like other lights on the track are pretty good, but that doesn't mean that there's still not people aren't still seeing strange things. Like both can exist.
No, I agree with that. It's just the stories of the figure, not the light so much as the figure, are very
Mhm.
reminiscent of things like probably your most famous is your Resurrection Mary stories that we all grew up with, Chicago area. So you get your hitchhiker sort of things, a person trying to get a ride from the place where they died to wherever. There's also the tragic automobile or buggy crash. And what's interesting to me, one of the interesting element about this is the story where it says that the woman was thrown into the creek where she died. Now, notwithstanding the fact that, as you saw, the creek is quite a ways from the railroad line itself. Now, again, did the creek shift? Did the railroad line change? Regardless of that, I think this is if a woman was hit by a train, it probably would be the train that killed them and not the water. So why is it that the story has to place that woman in the water? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a very specific element that I found in multiple tellings of the story, where she was hit by a train and thrown into the creek where she drowned. Which again, doesn't see it's such a particular thing to add. I'm not sure if it either maybe a part of that statement is the kernel of truth that this story originates from. Maybe someone was hit by a train and then like crawled into the creek trying to get away and then was found there or something like that, or something of the like. Maybe that's the kernel of truth, or maybe it just has fallen victim to it being blown out of proportion one time and then therefore it gets retold. That just happens to be the version that gets retold.
That are separate incidents, is what I'm saying, because otherwise, it's for whatever reason they have to get hit by the train, and or they have to get in the water. There's something about we have a need for the story to go both places that they converge like that. So what is the need for that? What symbolism is there? Or is it because we need to make this story fit another story that we've heard in another place, sort of thing?
I think that's a really good point, especially from like when you look at how folklore shifts over time. I mean, that would account for the fact why I couldn't find the specific story where this happened, because maybe it is because one person was hit on the tracks, one person drowned in the creek, but over time that melds into just one story. I think that's a very likely explanation for the provenance of a story like this.
I think I've talked about this before. When I lived in Mississippi, I heard the story of the kids on the train tracks and the school bus got hit by the train. And so
Mm-hmm.
if you put your car neutral on the train tracks, I had an aunt that told me the story. I think my mom told it to me too.
Yeah.
They had heard that story. And that story happens in so many different
Yes.
places
Mm-hmm.
across North America that it's just I heard this story and now I'm going to make it fit where I am, or it's just as the story's
Right.
told, we put it in different places. And I think that this might be a case of that because it's a country road, but it's not too far away from a pretty visited place, with the university being just a few
Mm-hmm.
miles away. Country road, creepy cemetery, railroad tracks, creek, bridges, all of these things which set the stage for a story like this. So, could there be some real stuff going on back there? Sure. Could there certainly be some tragic accidents that have happened back there, fatal accidents? I don't doubt that for any second. But this is kind of where I'm feeling. I'm feeling this is like the school bus on the railroad tracks sort of story here for me.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it's a good example of how when you look a little further past what like you're told, for these things, it's not that like we're trying to or in the process of like debunking this story. There's actually probably more history and more forgotten truths to these stories than what has made it into the current version. There's actually probably more there than just, the one paragraph that, I'm able to find on a lot of these issues.
I
Um,
think that's a really good point. A lot of these stories, as stories age, they begin to kind of converge and follow a stylistic thing. And the truth that was there is no less tragic, even if the true nature of what really happened, what evolved into the folk story, is largely forgotten.
I think lastly, I like the idea that people are still telling these stories, and that especially on like a stormy night like tonight, I kind of hope there's some 16-year-old kid with one of their friends out there tonight, being safe, obviously, but telling this story and driving down that road right now, like that's like
And if that's the purpose of the story, that's a good
exactly.
purpose. I
Exactly.
agree with that. So let me give you a couple snake stories here. I know you're
Woo!
excited because I was actually I picked up the copies of the old Keystone Folklore Quarterly. These were printed in the 1960s through Lycoming College
Oh,
over in
really?
Williamsport, Pennsylvania. And I picked a bunch of these up because, one, they were cheap, they're in great condition, and they are an academic sort of folklore journal. And I, of course, mine these for stories and everything
Absolutely.
all the time. So I wanted to read an excerpt. I'll kind of read the beginning and then the story itself. So an explanation from the story collector, David A. Walton, and then I'll read the excerpt itself. So allow me just a couple minutes here. Let me read the introduction to Pennsylvania Riverboat Tales 2. Son of Pennsylvania Riverboat Tales. This comes from the spring 1967 issue of the Keystone Folklore Quarterly. Again, that was published by Lycoming College over in Williamsport, Pennsylvania, in partner with the Pennsylvania Folklore Society. So, by David A. Walton, let me read this introduction here. This collection of folk tales is a transcript of a tape-recorded session with Louis Sesher, 74, of Lock 4, Pennsylvania. This was the second storytelling session with the informant and produced 46 stories, most of them tall tales. The first session is reproduced in Keystone Folklore Quarterly 11 for winter 1966. The transcripts which follows as an accurate rendering of the content of the session, with these exceptions. The dialect is not indicated by spelling and the verbal pauses are only approximate. The tape was recorded on the afternoon of April 5th, 1966. The original is archived at the Bowling Green State University Archives, Bowling Green, Ohio. Copies are housed in the Ethnic Culture Survey Collection of the Pennsylvania Historical Museum Commission in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. The tales in the excerpt are numbered in order in which they were told, except for digressions and side comments indicated by ellipses. And for tales repeated from the earlier transcription, the text represents the full content of the session. Delivery times are indicated in minutes and seconds at the beginning of each numbered session. So there, to quick introduction, I do want to say, doing the math, it turns out that the storyteller, Louis Sesher, being interviewed and recorded, would have been born around 1892. Just kind of give you some of the timeline here. In story 45 that he captures, I'm going to be reading 45 through 47 for you here. It starts with Walton asking, "Did you ever hear of hoop snakes?" Hoop snakes. Here's Sesher's story. "Oh, I wanted to tell you about that exactly. I took a job one time, helped dig a pipeline, you know. Dig for to bury a pipeline across the country, and we dug them by hand in them days. So I'd heard this hoop snake all the time. So they said that the area was full of them. So by golly, one, they supposed to take their tail in their mouth and roll like a hoop, and here we come in that ditch, and somebody hollered, 'Here he comes!' And I looked up and I saw him, and everybody else was able to jump out, but where I was too deep, you know. So I didn't know what to do. That snake coming at you, you know, and they claim they're terrible poison things. So I just stuck the pick down in the ground ahead of me, and he rolled up on that pick and looked at it and let go of his tail and struck that pick with his fangs on the handle. It must have been terrible poisonous, because the handle of that pick swelled up in about 3 seconds and busted the eye out of the pick. Yes, sir, it just broke the eye right out. And then the biggest snake I ever saw, I saw a snake down there in Ohio around Marietta. That was the biggest snake I ever saw. But another snake came up and swallowed it, a black snake. Then, them funniest thing down there, though, is when the turtles is flying over going south. Yeah, they, Duck Creek there around Marietta. Turtles gathered there from all through the area, and then they had a certain date that they all flew south. And oh, they make a terrible clatter, bumping their shells together, and going through the air.
This guy sounds like a good time. Wow. So the first thing I was gonna say was I'm like maybe turtles is another name for a type of bird. Like it's some like there's some colloquial name of like, oh, this is also called a turtle. Then he mentions the shells. So there's no chance. He's literally talking about turtles. I don't think I've ever heard of flying turtles before as like a thing. If you would have asked me about flying turtles, I would have said previously that they were jet powered, like water, like they kind of like you know how
Or like Gamera.
yeah, exactly, yeah, like yeah, and not like oh they have wings also. Like that's just a little that's like a step too far. But if you told me turtles somehow or use jet propelled water to fly, I'd be like okay, that's in the realm of possibility, I guess.
The guy is clearly telling tall tales,
Yeah,
and he makes that, even though he delivers it like it's a legit thing.
I love it.
This was very much documented as a teller of tall tales. But one of the things I found interesting about the hoop snake thing, and I don't want to steal any of your thunder because I know you love hoop snake stories, is I recall we've talked about a couple of the earliest places we've heard of hoop snakes, and I think the earliest written record I know of hoop snakes comes from 30 Years of Hunter, the Philip Tome memoir of being one of the first Europeans living in the northern tier of Pennsylvania and being a subsistence hunter. Was he telling them as a tall tale? It's kind of hard to tell when you're reading, but James York Glynn's collection of folk tales from Pennsylvania's northern tier mentions them. And the interesting thing is he specifically states that they will sting either with the barb on their tail or with their teeth. Wooden objects be like a rake and they'll swell up and burst. So I'm kind of curious if James York Glynn also got the story from this fella, or if this fella is telling an oft-told tall tale. But hoop snakes, Brendan.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think that whenever he's telling this story about digging the pipeline and the trenches and everything, I like the idea of a place being lousy with hoop snakes. The guy talks about like they're all over the place down there, like just rolling all through the swamp and up and down the roads, and you always have to keep your eye you have to keep your eye out for the hoop snakes. And then whenever one shows up, I think this is kind of the telling part is when one shows up and starts rolling towards them, everybody there knows to get out of the trench and out of the way. So like what he's kind of getting across by telling this hoop snake story is that everyone knows about hoop snakes. Like that's like the world building that's happening there, is that hoop snakes are so common that everyone there knows to get out of the trench because there's a hoop snake coming. That's how ubiquitous hoop snakes are in this area and in their lives, which is just, I love. He's, of course, the hero of this story by being in a precarious situation. He has to use his wit to get out of it. And he does not use anything to harm the snake necessarily. He kind of tricks it or distracts it by placing his pick into the ground and letting the snake hit that instead, which I think we see that a lot when we have people telling tall tales specifically, is that when they are inserted in the story, it's typically either as a observer, or if they are in the story like this one, they're usually the hero of the story, outwitting something. But he doesn't do it in like a boisterous way. It's not like, oh, let me tell you about the time I bested a hoop snake. It's just, again, he makes it sound like this is just a thing that happened on Tuesday before lunch. And he almost sounds like the worst part about it was he was down a pick.
The funniest thing I think about his biggest snake he ever saw is twofold. The story's funny because he never says how big the snake was, but he says that immediately upon seeing the snake, a larger snake comes out and just eats it.
Yeah, that's
like the biggest snake I ever saw, and then 2 seconds later, that snake was bested by a large snake that came and ate that snake. Never gives any indication. Like it could have been a very small snake, for example.
Yeah, I mean, like, I'm trying to think, like, what, like, if I saw if you'd never been to, like, the reptile room at the zoo, it wouldn't take a snake to be that big for you to honestly say, oh, that's the biggest snake I've ever seen. And then, but I mean, that's kind of telling about how I think they viewed nature, even even when telling jokes, basically saying like, hey, you might think something is incredible, but there's always something bigger or crazier out there. So don't get too high and mighty on it. I think that's an interesting storytelling kind of quirk.
Here's another thing to consider real quick too. Let's say this person heard this story and they were in their 20s. And I don't doubt he was digging a pipeline and he was in his 20s. Let's say 20s, up to 30. That's still, we're talking up to World War One. So this story was almost certainly generated before World War One, which is just another interesting thing, just timeline wise, to consider.
Yeah, because you have to look at I really don't know much about the dissemination of information when it comes to like snakes across the world. Like, did the average person back then know like how big pythons or anacondas got? Like, probably not, because they probably didn't like, there's probably in academia maybe, but I don't think the average person learned that like, oh yeah, there's freaking 30-foot pythons in the Amazon.
Well, and with there's so much misinformation out there about things, it wouldn't surprise me if people were not super well informed.
Yeah, so I think that like that's part of it too, that like I think that's why you see a lot of stories like this that exist on like the edge of science, where it's like, it sounds crazy, but to someone back then, again, this isn't us saying people were dumb back then, but it didn't sound any crazier than some of the other things that people did interact and see.
When the best information you had was either what you saw with your own eyes or came from a book, because if you lived, he's living in northern central Pennsylvania before World War One. There's not a lot of zoos up there or anything like that. There is now, not a lot, but there's Clyde Peelings, which herpetology is just a wonderful small zoo up there. But if you know any great snake stories or other kind of local lore that you want to turn us on to and make Brendan and his brother drive around to, how can people reach us?
Yeah, if you'd like to reach out to us, you can do so either on Instagram or Facebook at the Ghost Furnace Podcast, or you can send us an email at theghostfurnacepodcast@gmail.com.